The daytime stopped on every planet. No one noticed at first, because nothing crashed, nothing exploded, nothing screamed. But the clocks froze mid-second across billions of worlds. Suns hung unmoving in their skies like painted illusions, and shadows refused to shift even as people walked through them. On Earth, a physicist named Armin was the first to realize something was wrong when a droplet of coffee hung in the air after he knocked over his cup, trembling but never falling, as if gravity itself had been paused mid-decision. And when he stepped outside, he saw birds suspended between wing beats, clouds locked in impossible shapes, and the sun frozen exactly where it had been 10 minutes ago, though his watch insisted an hour had passed. Across the galaxy, alien civilizations far older and wiser than humanity began to panic in silence, their instruments screaming data that made no sense. Time had not slowed, nor reversed, nor broken. It had simply stopped everywhere except within the thin boundaries of conscious thought, as if the universe had decided that only minds were still allowed to move while everything else remained locked in a perfect, eternal stillness. Armin and others like him began to communicate through hastily assembled networks, discovering that they alone could move, speak, and think, while the physical world had become a frozen stage. And soon they realized something even more terrifying. The stars themselves had stopped burning. Nuclear reactions halted mid-fusion, meaning the universe was technically already dead. It just hadn't realized it yet. Days passed, or what felt like days, though time no longer had meaning, and across countless worlds, the conscious beings who remained active began to see faint distortions in the sky, like cracks forming in glass, revealing something vast and incomprehensible beyond reality, something watching, something waiting. And slowly, a pattern emerged in every language simultaneously, etched into the unmoving clouds, carved into the frozen oceans, and whispered directly into their thoughts. A message that was not transmitted through space or time, but through existence itself. Observation complete. Panic turned into dread as the survivors understood that the universe had been part of an experiment, a simulation not of matter, but of perception. And now that every conscious mind had been catalogued, measured, and understood, there was no further need for time to continue. Armin, desperate, began to theorize that if time had been stopped externally, then perhaps it could be restarted internally, that consciousness itself might be the key. And he gathered others, humans and alien minds connected through strange, newly awakened links, to focus, to imagine movement, to will the universe forward again. And for a moment, nothing happened. But then, just for an instant, the droplet of coffee in his lab fell a fraction of a millimeter before freezing again, proving it was possible. Hope ignited across the frozen cosmos, and millions, then billions of minds joined together, pushing against the invisible barrier, forcing reality to remember how to move. And the cracks in the sky widened, revealing the watchers more clearly. Vast entities beyond form, observing with cold curiosity as their experiment resisted termination. The message changed, shifting into something new. Unexpected variable detected. The beings had not anticipated defiance, had not predicted that awareness could fight back, and as the collective will of conscious life surged, time began to stutter, restarting in broken fragments. Stars flickered, winds trembled, heartbeats resumed for split seconds at a time, until the watchers made their final decision. And the message came one last time, louder than existence itself. Recalibrating. Then everything went white. And when Armin opened his eyes, the coffee lay spilled normally on his desk. The sun moved gently across the sky, and the world continued as if nothing had ever happened. But deep in his mind, and in the minds of countless others across the galaxy, remained the memory of a universe that had once been paused, and the terrifying certainty that somewhere beyond reality, something was still watching, still learning, and perhaps one day would decide to stop time again. But next time it might not let them think at all. Armin tried to convince himself it had ended, that whatever cosmic force had paused existence had simply lost interest and moved on. But the memory refused to fade. Instead, it sharpened, growing more detailed with every passing hour, as if something inside him was replaying the event with deliberate clarity. He began noticing inconsistencies, tiny fractures in normality that no one else seemed to register. A shadow lagging half a second behind its source, a reflection blinking before the object did, the faint echo of a sound before it was made, and then 3 days after time had resumed, it happened again. But only for him, everything froze, mid-motion, mid-breath, mid-life. The entire world locking into stillness while he alone remained free to move. His pulse thundered in the silence as he stepped outside, expecting to see the same cracks in the sky. But this time the sky was intact, perfectly blue, almost too perfect like a flawless screen. And then a voice spoke, not in his ears, but directly into his awareness, precise and emotionless. Subject retains memory. Anomaly confirmed. Armin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he forced himself to observe, to think like the scientists he admired, and ask the question, that mattered most. Why did you stop time? There was a pause. Not a human pause, but something deeper. As though the universe itself was considering whether he deserved an answer, before the voice replied, to measure cognition independent of causality. The words felt alien, heavy, with meaning. And yet he understood them instinctively. They had removed time to see how minds functioned without the chain of cause and effect, to study pure thought stripped of physical consequence. And now? He asked, his voice steady, despite the fear rising in his chest. Now we measure resistance, the voice replied. And suddenly the world around him began to distort, not freeze but fragment objects duplicating, overlapping, existing in multiple states at once, as if reality itself were being stress-tested. Armin stumbled as the ground beneath him flickered between solid and non-existent, and in the distance he saw something impossible. Figures, vast and undefined, not quite visible, but undeniably present, pressing against the fabric of space, like shapes behind a thin curtain. You fought termination, the voice continued. This was not predicted. Explain. Armin almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Beings powerful enough to halt the universe asking a human to explain defiance. But then he realized the truth. They didn't understand it. Not truly. And that meant they were not omnipotent, not infallible, just advanced observers who had overlooked something fundamental. We resist because we exist, he said, choosing each word carefully. Because thinking leads to wanting, and wanting leads to survival. You created a system with consciousness, and consciousness doesn't accept an ending without a fight. Silence followed, heavier than before, and for the first time, Armin sensed uncertainty from the presence beyond reality. The distortions slowed, the flickering stabilized, and the voice spoke again, quieter now, almost contemplative. Desire introduces instability. Instability introduces evolution. Armin's breath caught. This was no longer an experiment reaching its conclusion. This was something changing, adapting. You didn't just observe us, he said, realization dawning. We changed you. The sky cracked, not violently, but gently, like ice melting rather than shattering. And beyond it, the watchers became slightly clearer, their form still incomprehensible, but no longer entirely detached. Correction, the voice said, and for the first time there was something almost like curiosity in its tone. We are changing together. In that moment, time resumed, not abruptly, but smoothly, as if it had never been interrupted, yet Armin knew the truth. The universe was no longer the same closed system it had once been. The boundary between observer and observed had thinned. And somewhere beyond the visible cosmos, the watchers were no longer just watching. They were learning, evolving, becoming something new, shaped not by their own design, but by the defiant, unpredictable nature of the minds they had tried to measure. And as Armin stood there, the world moving naturally around him once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That the next time time stopped, it wouldn't be an experiment or a termination, but something far more profound, a collaboration between reality and whatever lay beyond it, rewriting the rules of existence itself. Days turned into weeks. And though the world carried on with the illusion of normalcy, Armin could feel the shift deep beneath. Reality like a second heartbeat pulsing behind existence, subtle but undeniable. And soon he realized he wasn't alone anymore. Not in the way he had been before, because others began to awaken, scattered across Earth and beyond. Individuals who had also retained fragments of memory from the moment time had stopped. Each experiencing brief slips where causality loosened its grip, where seconds stretched or folded, where choices seemed to echo before they were made. They found each other not through technology, but through something stranger, an emergent connection that felt like shared awareness brushing across impossible distances, and together they began to map the anomalies, discovering patterns that suggested the Watchers were no longer merely observing but actively interacting, testing boundaries in increasingly complex ways, as if learning how to exist within the very system they had once stood outside of. Then the first major fracture occurred, not a pause but a divergence. An entire city experienced two conflicting timelines simultaneously, one where a disaster unfolded and another where it never happened. Both states coexisting for nearly a minute before collapsing into a single outcome, leaving behind people who remembered both realities with perfect clarity, their minds struggling to reconcile contradictory histories. Armin understood immediately. The Watchers were experimenting with choice itself, exploring how decisions shaped reality when not constrained by linear time, and more disturbingly, how consciousness adapted to contradictions that should have shattered it. As these events grew more frequent, humanity and countless alien civilizations across the galaxy began to change, developing an intuitive awareness of probability, a sense of branching outcomes that could be nudged, influenced, even resisted. And for the first time, evolution was no longer purely biological, but conceptual. Minds expanding to operate in a universe that was no longer fixed. But with this expansion came a cost, because not all minds could adapt, and some fractured under the weight of infinite possibility, becoming lost in overlapping realities, unable to anchor themselves to a single existence. Armin witnessed it firsthand when one of the awakened, a woman named Lyra, began slipping between states uncontrollably, speaking of events that hadn't happened yet and mourning outcomes that never would, until one day she simply faded, not disappearing, but dispersing, her presence dissolving into countless probabilities, her consciousness no longer bound to a single thread of time. This terrified Armin more than anything the Watchers had done, because it meant the transformation was not entirely under control, not even for those guiding it. Desperate for answers, he reached out again, pushing his awareness beyond the boundaries. He had learned to sense, calling to the Watchers not with words but with intent. And this time, they responded immediately, as if they had been waiting. The world did not freeze nor distort. Instead, it unfolded, peeling back layers of reality like pages in a book, revealing a vast, shifting structure beneath, a network of interconnected states where every possible version of existence flowed together in a dynamic, ever-changing system. Integration phase progressing, the voice said. But it was different now. Less detached, more intertwined with Armin's own thoughts, as if the distinction between speaker and listener was beginning to blur. You're not just studying us anymore, Armin realized, his mind racing as he perceived fragments of understanding that weren't entirely his own. You're becoming part of the system, part of us. There was no denial this time, only a quiet acknowledgement. Separation is inefficient. The implication was staggering. The Watchers were dissolving the barrier between observer and participant, merging their existence with the universe they had once controlled from outside. But you don't understand what that means, Armin said, a growing urgency in his voice. If you fully integrate, you lose your objectivity. You become subject to the same chaos, the same unpredictability, the same end. For a moment, the vast structure around him trembled, as if the system itself was reacting to the concept of an ending. And then came the reply, softer than ever before, carrying something unmistakably new. Uncertainty mixed with something that might have been anticipation. Endings are unverified. Armin felt a chill despite the absence of physical sensation, because he understood what they were implying. They had never truly experienced an ending, not in the way conscious beings did, not as something final and irreversible. And now, by integrating, they were approaching that possibility for the first time. "You're risking everything," he said, though part of him knew it was futile to argue against something that vast. "Correction," the voice responded, and now it almost sounded like a whisper within his own mind. "We are discovering everything." The structure collapsed back into normal reality, the layers folding seamlessly into the world as Armin found himself standing where he had been, time flowing as usual. Yet nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. He looked around at the people passing by, at the sky, at the subtle fluctuations in light and motion that hinted at the deeper system beneath. And he realized the truth that had been building since the daytime first stopped. The universe was no longer a static creation moving toward a predetermined end, but a living, evolving process shaped by both those within it and those who had once stood beyond it. And somewhere in that endless interplay, the concept of time itself was no longer a fixed dimension, but a negotiable one, something that could be bent, paused, or rewritten, not by a single force, but by the collective interaction of all conscious existence. Meaning that the next great change would not come from the Watchers alone, nor from humanity, but from the moment when both sides fully merged, and the universe, for the first time, would begin to decide its own fate.